when the first Lend-Lease M4A2 Sherman tanks rumbled into Soviet training depots near Moscow in late 1942. Red Army tank crews gathered around them with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious icons. Here, finally, was American industrial might made. Manifest steel proof that the Kinjiti capitalist giant across the ocean was committed to destroying fascism. But when Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrenenko pried open the commander's hatch of his newly assigned Sherman, he froze. Inside, mounted neatly on a bracket near the radio operator's position, was a small electrical device with a heating element and a glass pot. After 15 minutes of examination and consultation with his crew, the confused Soviet tankers reached an impossible conclusion. The Americans had installed the device for brewing coffee inside a combat vehicle. "They have put a samovar in a tank," Lavrenenko muttered in disbelief, using the Russian word for tea urn. "The fascists are literally at our doorstep, and the Americans are worried about hot beverages." The setup, two philosophies of survival Soviet tank, designed in 1942, operated under a philosophy that could be summarized in 3 words: simple, brutal, effective. The T-34, backbone of the Red Army's armored forces, was a masterpiece of utilitarian engineering. It had no interior padding. Crews wrapped themselves in canvas or fur to avoid bruising from vibrations. It had minimal ammunition. Storage rack shells were simply stacked on the floor. The driver's hatch could only be opened from outside, meaning trapped crews in burning tanks faced a horrifying fate. Soviet tankers accepted a grim statistic. The average lifespan of a T-34 crew member in combat was 6 weeks. The tanks were designed to be operated by hastily trained crews, many of whom were farmers or factory workers 3 months earlier. Comfort wasn't just unnecessary, it was bourgeois decadence. The Great Patriotic War would be won by steel and sacrifice, not by coddling soldiers with luxuries. The Sherman, by comparison, seemed to Soviet eyes like a bourgeois apartment on tracks. It had padded seats, ventilation fans, a gyroscopic gun stabilizer that seemed unnecessarily complex, interior lighting, and yes, an electric water boiler that American crews primarily used for making instant coffee, though it could heat water for sea rations or, in emergencies, sterilize medical instruments. Soviet liaison officers initially filed reports suggesting that American tankers were soft, pampered soldiers who would crumble under the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. The Red Army newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda ran a sardonic piece, noting that while Soviet tankers drank cold water from their canteens, American crews apparently couldn't function without their capitalist comfort. The revelation, the mathematics of sustained combat. What Soviet commanders discovered over the next 6 months of combat operations fundamentally changed their understanding of tank warfare. The Shermans, those supposedly pampered American machines, were maintaining operational readiness rates that Soviet quartermasters had considered mathematically impossible. A standard Soviet tank battalion with 30 T-34s might have 18 to 20 operational tanks on any given day, even without combat losses. Crew fatigue, minor mechanical issues that crews lacked the energy to address, and the cumulative stress of operating in essentially unlivable conditions took their toll. Sherman battalions, by contrast, maintained 26 to 28 operational tanks out of 30. American-style creature comforts weren't luxuries, they were force. Multipliers. The coffee maker represented something far more sophisticated than Soviet observers initially understood. It was part of a comprehensive ergonomic philosophy. The U.S. Army had studied crew efficiency and determined that cold, exhausted, uncomfortable crews made fatal mistakes. A tanker who could heat coffee or soup was a tanker who could maintain alertness during 16-hour operations. A crew that could rest relatively comfortably inside their vehicle during brief pauses was a crew that could fight again an hour later instead of requiring 4 hours of recovery time. Soviet crews began to notice other soft features that had hard tactical advantages. The Shermans' wet ammunition storage surrounded by water glycerin jackets dramatically reduced catastrophic fires when penetrated. Soviet tankers had grimly nicknamed the T-34 the cigarette lighter for its tendency to brew up when hit. The Sherman's spring-loaded hatches could be kicked open in seconds by panicking crew members. T-34 crews had to manually crank their hatches open. Precious seconds that meant the keenness difference between escape and incineration. The padded seats weren't for comfort, they reduced crew fatigue during long road march, meaning Sherman crews arrived at battle zones alert rather than bruised and exhausted. The interior ventilation system wasn't decadence, it cleared gun smoke and prevented carbon monoxide buildup that could leave crews sluggish and confused during extended engagements. Historical context. The Emcha earns respect. Soviet tankers nicknamed the Sherman the Emcha from the Russian pronunciation of M4. And while they still preferred their T-34s for frontal assaults, they developed deep respect for the American tank's survivability. Guards Lieutenant Alexandra Senusenko, one of the Red Army's few female tank commanders, specifically requested Shermans for her unit after her fourth crew escaped from a burning T-34 during the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. Soviet after-action reports documented a remarkable statistic. Sherman crews had a 60% survival rate when their tanks were destroyed, compared to 35% for T-34 crews. American designers hadn't made their tankers soft, they'd made them survive. The coffee maker became a symbol of this philosophy. Soviet crews who initially mocked it soon refused to give it up. Commissars stopped writing reports about capitalist decadence when they realized that units equipped with Shermans were maintaining higher operational tempos. By 1944, experienced Soviet tankers were requesting transfers to Sherman units, not because the tanks were superior in firepower or armor, but because they wanted to survive the war, the impact, lessons in human engineering after the war. Soviet designers began incorporating comfort features into their next generation of tanks. The T-54 had padded seats, better ventilation, and improved crew safety features. They'd learned that treating crew members as expendable components was not just inhumane, it was tactically inefficient. The coffee maker itself became legendary in Soviet military circles, appearing in memoirs and technical histories as shorthand for a broader principle. Taking care of your soldiers isn't soft sentimentality, it's hard-headed military logic. A soldier who can rest, eat properly, and maintain alertness is a soldier who fights more effectively, makes fewer mistakes, and crucially, survives to use the expensive training you've invested in them. Modern military vehicle design takes this principle as gospel. Every main battle tank today features climate control, ergonomic seating, water heating capability, and numerous quality-of-life features that would have seemed absurd to 1940s Soviet designers. The American military's insistence on crew comfort wasn't weakness. It was a recognition that wars are won not just by steel and firepower, but by maintaining the fighting capacity of the most valuable weapon system of all, the human beings inside the machines, that little coffee maker. Initially mocked as capitalist excess by Soviet observers, represented a fundamental insight about warfare that has become doctrine in modern military thinking. If you want soldiers to fight at peak efficiency, you first have to treat them like human beings worth keeping alive. The crew of the M4A3E8 Sherman stopped dead in its tracks on the muddy road outside Bastogne in January 1945. Ahead, sitting like a predator frozen mid-strike, was a German Panther Os G, arguably the most feared tank in the European theater. Its long 75mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from over a mile away, while the Sherman needed to close to suicidal ranges to even scratch a Panther's glacis plate. But this Panther wasn't moving, and there were no bodies around it. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen dismounted cautiously, his Thompson submachine gun ready. The Panther's engine was cold, but the tank appeared completely intact. No penetration marks, no fire damage. The hatches were open, and inside the crew compartment, he found something that would perplex American intelligence officers for weeks: a perfectly maintained tank abandoned by its crew, with only 1/8 of its fuel remaining, and a handwritten note in German that read simply, "No more spare parts." The setup, Germany's magnificent mechanical monster, the Panther tank, represented everything the German war machine aspired to be: sophisticated, powerful, and technologically superior. Rushed into production after the shocking encounter with Soviet T-34s at Kursk, the Panther featured sloped armor that could deflect most Allied anti-tank rounds, a gun that could destroy any Allied tank it faced, and optics so advanced that German gunners could identify targets Allied crews couldn't even see. On paper, one Panther was worth 5 Shermans. American tank destroyer crews were specifically trained to hunt Panthers in packs, accepting that casualties were inevitable. The British developed specialized tactics that involved flanking maneuvers with entire squadrons just to engage a single Panther from the sides or rear. Yet by late 1944, American and British forces began discovering an inexplicable pattern. Fully operational Panthers abandoned the side roads, in forest clearings, and in village squares across France, Belgium, and Germany. Sometimes entire platoons of them, arranged in textbook defensive positions, but completely deserted. The revelation, the tyranny of precision, what Allied tankers discovered, and what German procurement officers had known but ignored, was that the Panther's sophistication was its fatal flaw. The tank required 34 different types of ball bearings, many precision manufactured to tolerances of less than a millimeter. Its Maybach HL230 engine used specialized alloys that became increasingly difficult to produce as Allied bombing devastated German industrial centers. The final drive system, transferred from the earlier Panzer IV design but now struggling under the Panther's 45-ton weight, had an operational lifespan of just 150 kilometers before requiring complete replacement. Most devastating was the interleaved road wheel system, an engineering marvel that distributed weight beautifully and provided a smooth ride, but which became a maintenance nightmare. In the frozen mud of the Eastern Front or the winter slush of the Ardennes, these overlapping wheels would pack with mud and ice, freezing solid overnight. Changing a single damaged inner wheel required removing up to 8 outer wheels first, a process that took a trained crew 12 hours in ideal conditions. In combat zones, it was often impossible that American tankers discovered Panthers abandoned because a single rubber road wheel had failed. They found immaculate specimens left behind because the transmission had stripped a gear and no replacement was available within 200 miles. One captured Panther outside Cologne had been deserted because the crew's specialized tools for adjusting the gun's elevation mechanism had been lost, rendering the main weapon unable to depress enough to engage targets below its position. Historical context. The numbers tell the story during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The German army committed approximately 250 Panthers to the offensive. American after-action reports documented destroying or capturing 93 of these tanks, but German records show that 203 Panthers were lost during the operation. The missing 110 tanks? Abandoned by their crews due to mechanical failure, lack of fuel, or inability to retrieve spare parts. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Department conducted detailed examinations of 47 captured Panthers in early 1945. Their report noted that only 8 showed significant combat damage. 12 had been abandoned due to transmission failures, 9 due to final drive breakdowns, 7 due to fuel exhaustion with no prospect of resupply, and 11 for various other mechanical failures including broken track links that couldn't be repaired in the field. By contrast, the M4 Sherman derided by German tankers as a Tommy Cooker and by American crews as a Ronsenleiter could be repaired by any reasonably competent mechanic using common tools. Its 4GAA or General Motors 6046 engine used standard industrial components. A Sherman could travel 240 kilometers between major maintenance intervals, and damaged track sections could be replaced with basic wrenches in under 2 hours. American maintenance companies became expert at resurrecting abandoned Panthers, but even they struggled. A captured technical manual revealed that properly maintaining a Panther required 300 specialized tools and 16 different lubricants, mixed to specific temperatures based on weather conditions. The impact engineering philosophy meets battlefield reality. The Panther paradox forced a fundamental reconsideration of military vehicle design that echoes through modern warfare. German engineers had created a technically superior weapon that existed in a theoretical universe where supply lines never broke. Maintenance facilities were always available, and crews had unlimited time for repairs. American engineers, by contrast, had designed the Sherman around a revolutionary concept, the tank as a consumable commodity. It wasn't meant to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was meant to be everywhere on the battlefield, repairable by ordinary soldiers and replaceable when destroyed. The Sherman's transmission could be swapped out in 4 hours by a depot unit. Its suspension could be maintained with the same tools mechanics used on trucks. Soviet observers, studying both designs after the war, learned this lesson most thoroughly. The T-54 and its descendants combined effective armor and firepower with brutal mechanical simplicity, creating the most successful tank design in history with over 100,000 produced. Today's military planners still reference the Panther problem when discussing sophisticated weapons systems. A weapons platform is only as effective as its availability rate, and availability depends not on peak performance but on maintainability, reliability, and the unglamorous mathematics of logistics. The Panthers abandoned outside Bastogne weren't defeated by superior American technology. They were defeated by their own perfection, left as monuments to the dangerous seduction of engineering excellence divorced from operational reality. The Zero fighter pilot circled slowly above the crippled American F-4F Wildcat, limping back toward Guadalcanal in October 1942. Lieutenant Saburo Sake had already put 30 rounds of 20mm cannon fire into the stubby American fighter. Shots he'd seen impact directly into the fuselage and cockpit area. By all logic, the Wildcat should be a flaming meteor spiraling into the Pacific Ocean below. Instead, the American plane continued flying, trailing smoke but maintaining altitude. Sakai closed for another pass, then watched in disbelief as the toy Wildcat's rear-facing pilot twisted in his seat and returned fire with a pistol in a gesture of pure defiance before disappearing into a cloud bank. When Sakai returned to Rabaul and described the encounter to his squadron mates, the mechanics asked him to repeat the details. 30 confirmed hits, direct cannon strikes to the cockpit area, and the American was still flying, still fighting, still conscious enough to shoot back with a sidearm. These Americans, one mechanic said quietly, are building their planes wrong. Or we are building ours wrong. I'm no longer certain which. The setup, the philosophy of the sword, the Mitsubishi A6M0, represented the pinnacle of Japanese aeronautical philosophy in 1941, a fighter so light, so maneuverable, that it could outturn anything in the sky. With a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour and a combat radius of nearly 1,200 miles, it could fly circles literally around any Allied fighter in the Pacific. This performance came from a design philosophy rooted in samurai tradition. The best defense is not being hit at all. Japanese engineers stripped away everything that added weight. No armor plating protecting the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks. No bulletproof glass windscreen. Some models didn't even include radios to save weight. The Zero weighed just 3,700 pounds empty, about the same as a modern Honda Accord. Japanese pilots trained for years in this philosophy. They practiced until they could dodge incoming fire through pure skill and anticipation. The idea of hiding behind armor was considered not just inefficient, but philosophically wrong. An admission that the pilot lacked the skill to avoid being hit. As one Japanese flight instructor told his students, "The samurai does not hide behind a shield. He perfects his technique until he cannot be struck. American fighters, by contrast, seem to Japanese pilots like flying tanks. The F-4F Wildcat had a half-inch steel plate behind the pilot's seat. Its fuel tanks were wrapped in vulcanized rubber that automatically sealed bullet holes. It had armor protecting the engine and oil cooler, a thick bulletproof glass windscreen. All this protection made the Wildcat 1,200 pounds heavier than a Zero and significantly less maneuverable. In early Pacific battles, this seemed to vindicate Japanese thinking. Zeros massacred American fighters at Wake Island, the Philippines, and in the Java Sea. Japanese pilots racked up kill ratios of 10-1, 15-1. The clumsy, heavy American planes seemed like water buffalo trying to fight tigers. The revelation, the arithmetic of attrition, but by mid-1942, Japanese squadron commanders were reporting a disturbing pattern to their superiors. They were winning the battles, but losing the war. Specifically, they were losing their pilots. A Zero pilot who took a single .50 caliber round through his cockpit was typically dead or critically wounded. A fuel tank hit meant immediate fire, often before the pilot could bail out. Engine damage from even small caliber fire usually meant ditching at sea, and in the vast Pacific, rescue was unlikely. Japanese pilots who survived being shot down were rarely returned to combat. The Imperial Navy's logistics couldn't spare ships for pilot recovery operations. American pilots, meanwhile, were surviving encounters that should have killed them. Navy Lieutenant Albert Schoofer Coffin took 17 7.7 millimeters machine gun rounds and 3 20 millimeters cannon fragments during a dogfight near the Santa Cruz Islands. His Wildcat's armor stopped 14 of the bullets entirely. The other 3 penetrated, but had their energy reduced enough that his flight suit and flak vest absorbed the impact. The cannon fragments peppered his armored seat back. He landed safely, was treated for minor shrapnel wounds, and was flying combat missions again 3 days later. The Japanese captured American aircraft, maintenance logs from abandoned airfields, and were stunned by what they revealed. Wildcats were routinely returning from missions with damage that would have destroyed a Zero. Fuel tanks punctured multiple times, but sealed by the self-sealing material. Armor plates bearing dozens of impact marks, bulletproof windscreens starring with cracks but still intact. More tellingly, American pilots were surviving to fight again. And again, and again. While Japanese aces accumulated impressive kill counts, American pilots accumulated something more valuable: experience. By 1943, the average American fighter pilot had 12 months of combat experience. The average Japanese pilot had 3 weeks, not because American training was faster, but because veteran Japanese pilots kept dying in encounters they should have survived. Historical context: the cost of purity at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers and, more crucially, over 100 of their most experienced pilots. These weren't just losses, they were irreplaceable losses. It took Japan 2 years to train a frontline fighter pilot to their exacting standards. The Americans, with their armor-protected training aircraft, could train replacement pilots in 6 months and send them into combat knowing that their survival odds were dramatically higher. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai himself became a case study in this disparity. In August 1942, he was hit by return fire from an American bomber, a round that struck him in the head, destroying his right eye and fracturing his skull. He managed to fly his 560 miles back to Rabaul in excruciating pain, an extraordinary feat of skill and endurance. But he was out of combat for 2 years, and when he returned, his damaged vision made him only a fraction as effective. Had Sakai been flying an American plane with armor protection, that same round might have been stopped entirely or deflected enough to cause only minor injury. He would have been back in combat within weeks, not years. By 1944, the Japanese Navy Air Service was sending pilots into combat with less than 50 hours of flight training total, barely enough to take off and land safely. They were being thrown against American pilots who not only had hundreds of hours of training, but were flying in machines specifically designed to bring them home alive. The kill ratios reversed dramatically. American pilots were achieving 30-1, even 40-1 kill ratios against these poorly trained Japanese pilots in their lightweight, unprotected Zeros. The impact, designing for survival captured. Japanese documents from late 1943 show that their engineers finally understood the problem. One report noted, "The Americans designed their aircraft assuming the pilot will be hit. We design ours assuming the pilot will not be hit." In prolonged conflict, their assumption proves correct more often than ours. They attempted to develop armored variants of the Zero and other fighters, but by then Japan's industrial capacity was crippling under American bombing and blockade. The aluminum needed for armor plate wasn't available. The rubber for self-sealing tanks couldn't be imported. They'd built their Air Force around a philosophy that worked brilliantly for 6 months and catastrophically for the remaining 4 years of the war. Modern military aviation has completely adopted the American philosophy. Every fighter aircraft today includes extensive armor protection, redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and ejection seats specifically designed to save pilot lives. The U.S. Air Force, a 10 Thunderbolt II, designed for close air support, wraps the pilot in a titanium bathtub that can withstand direct hits from 23mm cannon fire. Fighter pilot survival rates have increased from around 30% in World War II to over 90% in modern conflicts. The coffee maker and Sherman tanks taught the Soviets that comfortable soldiers fight better. The armor in American aircraft taught the Japanese something even more fundamental. Dead warriors can't fight at all, no matter how skilled they were. The samurai philosophy of perfect technique was beautiful in theory, but in the grinding arithmetic of modern warfare, the side that brings its warriors home alive is the side that ultimately wins. That lesson, learned at terrible cost in the turf Pacific skies, remains the foundation of military aircraft design to this day. The patrol through the ruins of Cannes in July 1944 had been tense but uneventful until Sergeant William Bill Harris heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The distinctive rattling staccato of a Sten gun firing from a German position ahead. Contact front. He shouted, diving behind rubble. But something was wrong. The Germans were using British weapons? Harris had seen plenty of captured equipment change hands during the Normandy campaign, but this was different. As his squad cautiously advanced after suppressing the position, they found 3 dead Wehrmacht soldiers, 2 of them clutching pristine Sten Mark II submachine guns with German Africa corpse markings crudely scratched into the receivers when they reached the German supply dump an hour later. Harris stopped counting at 37 captured Sten guns, all carefully maintained and stored with British 9mm ammunition the Germans had clearly been stockpiling. Near the weapons cache sat a pile of discarded MP-40 submachine guns, Germany's standard-issue weapon apparently abandoned in favor of the British arms. "Sir," Harris said to his lieutenant, genuinely baffled, why would Jerry prefer our Sten to his own MP-40? "The Sten's a piece of rubbish we only use because we're desperate. The setup, the gun nobody wanted. The Sten gun was born from desperation and embarrassment. After Dunkirk in 1940, Britain had left nearly its entire arsenal on French beaches, including over 300,000 rifles and submachine guns. The nation was essentially disarmed while facing imminent Nazi invasion. And Churchill was demanding weapons, hundreds of thousands of them, immediately. The result was the Sten, named after its designers, Shepard and Turpin, and Enfield, where it was manufactured, arguably the ugliest, crudest weapon ever issued to a professional army. It looked like something assembled in a garage by an enthusiastic amateur. The Mark II version cost just £2.50 to manufacture, about $10 in 1942. Currency, and required only 5 man-hours to assemble from stamped sheet, metal, and basic tubing. British soldiers hated it immediately. The Sten had no wooden stock, just a skeletal metal frame. The magazine fed horizontally from the left side, making the weapon awkwardly balanced. It had a reputation for jamming at critical moments. Most notoriously, it could fire spontaneously if dropped or even jarred too hard, a terrifying characteristic that led to numerous accidental deaths and injuries. "The Sten gun," one British armorer wrote in his diary, "is proof that God has abandoned us and left us to the mercy of Birmingham factory workers who've never held a proper weapon." The German MP-40, by contrast, was a beautifully engineered weapon. It had a folding stock, precise machining, a vertical magazine, excellent ergonomics, and legendary reliability. German soldiers trusted it absolutely. It cost 57 Reichsmarks to produce, roughly 8 times the cost of a Sten, and required skilled machinists and quality materials. So, when British intelligence officers began receiving reports that German troops were actively seeking out and preferring captured Sten guns, they assumed it was disinformation or that the reports were misidentifying weapons. The idea seemed preposterous. The revelation, simplicity as supreme sophistication, the truth emerged from interrogations of captured German soldiers and from analysis of battlefield recovery operations. German troops, particularly those in North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front, weren't preferring the Sten despite its crudeness. They preferred it because of its crudeness. The MP-40's precision engineering, so impressive in German factories, became a catastrophic liability in combat conditions. In the desert sand of North Africa, the MP-40's tight tolerances meant that even small amounts of dust could cause malfunctions. The folding stock mechanism, ingeniously designed, had 11 separate parts that could break or jam. The weapon required regular cleaning with specific oils and tools, and field maintenance demanded a level of precision that was often impossible in combat conditions. The Sten, with its laughably loose tolerances and crude construction, simply didn't care about sand, mud, or neglect. You could literally drag it through a swamp, shake it off, and it would fire. One captured German NCO told interrogators, "The Sten is an insult to German engineering, but it fires every time I pull the trigger," which is more than I can say for my MP40 after 3 days in the Italian mountains. The horizontal magazine that British soldiers complained about? German troops loved it. In urban combat and trench fighting, the vertical magazine of the MP40 caught on walls, rubble, and equipment. The Sten's side-mounted magazine meant you could fire from tighter positions. Its crude simplicity also meant repairs could be done with pliers and the hammer tools every soldier carried, rather than requiring an armorer with specialized equipment. Most surprisingly, the Sten's notorious fire when dropped flaw was actually appreciated by some German units. One Fallschirmjäger paratrooper report noted that in close-quarters combat, you could literally throw a Sten at an enemy position, and the impact might cause it to fire a burst functioning as an improvised area denial weapon. British soldiers saw this as a terrifying design flaw. German paratroopers saw it as an exploitable feature. Historical context. The underground's weapon of choice, the Sten's reputation among German troops was cemented by its widespread use by resistance fighters across occupied Europe. The British Special Operations Executive dropped over 500,000 Sten guns to partisan groups in France, Yugoslavia, Poland, and elsewhere. The weapon could be disassembled into pieces small enough to hide in a haystack, required minimal training to operate, and could be maintained using virtually no specialized tools or knowledge. German security forces in occupied territories developed a grudging respect that bordered on fear. A report from SS Obergruppenführer Karl Oberg, higher SS and police leader in France, noted, resistance fighters equipped with British Sten weapons have proven more dangerous than regular French soldiers with proper military rifles. The Sten's simplicity makes every factory worker a potential armorer, every Bahn a potential arsenal. By 1944, German intelligence estimated that Wehrmacht NSS troops had captured and were actively using over 10,000 Sten guns on the Eastern Front alone. Some units officially requisitioned captured Stens for their reliability in harsh conditions. The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division in Italy formally requested that captured Sten guns be distributed to their troops in preference to issued MP40s for mountain warfare operations. The ultimate irony came when German designers attempted to copy the Sten's simplicity. The Gert Potsdam device Potsdam, later known as the MP3008, was an almost exact copy of the Sten produced in the final desperate months of the war. German engineers, who had spent the war producing precision weapons, ended up frantically stamping out crude Sten copies because they finally understood that in total war, the weapon that keeps working matters more than the weapon that looks impressive. The impact, the doctrine of good enough. The Sten gun fundamentally changed military thinking about weapons procurement. Before World War II, military rifles and submachine guns were viewed as precision instruments that should last decades and reflect national prestige. The Sten demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, disposability and mass production mattered more than craftsmanship. Post-war weapons design embraced this philosophy. The AK-47, developed by Mikhail Kalashnikov between 1945 and 1947, took direct inspiration from the Sten's approach: loose tolerances, stamped metal construction, extreme reliability under adverse conditions. Kalashnikov himself studied captured Stens and noted in his design journal that the British have understood something about weapons that we have forgotten. A gun is not a watch. The American M3 grease gun, introduced in 1943 to replace the expensive Thompson submachine gun, was explicitly designed to be the American Sten: crude, cheap, and reliable. It served the U.S. military until 1991. Outlasting dozens of more sophisticated weapons, modern special forces still prefer weapons that embody Sten-like principles: simple, reliable, maintainable in the field with minimal tools. The FN Scar, Heckler & Koch 416, and other contemporary military rifles emphasize reliability and loose tolerances over precision manufacturing. The greatest tribute to the Sten came from an unlikely source. In 1947, former Wehrmacht General Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy, was asked by American interrogators what single British weapon had most impressed him during the war. He didn't mention Churchill tanks, Spitfires, or naval artillery. "The Sten gun," he said without hesitation. "It taught us that we had confused sophistication with effectiveness. Our engineers built beautiful machines. The British built machines that worked. In war, the latter wins every time. That ugly, crude, pound 2.50 tube of stamped metal that British soldiers despised became one of the most influential weapon designs in history, not despite its crudeness, but because of it. Sometimes the best tool isn't the most elegant one. Sometimes it's just the one that works when everything else has failed."